When times are tough
The world is about to end?
and the world looks bleak,
It was impossible.
there is only one man who can save us from ourselves.
The one thing you know when you're born is that you will die.
This is Howard Bloom Saves the Universe,
I believe they believe it, even though I find it very hard to believe that they believe it.
with noted author, speaker, and philosopher Howard Bloom.
Attention is the oxygen of the human soul.
And now, here's Howard and our MC, Chad Dugatz.
Hello and welcome to Howard Bloom Saves the Universe with Mr. Howard Bloom. I am Chad Dugatz, opposite Howard.
And I'm Howard Bloom. It's nice to be here again.
It's been a long time. It's only been 2 weeks, but
It's been 2 weeks.
It feels very
Oh,
long.
God. We've had a year of political events in those 2 weeks.
Speaking of events, right now as we're recording at 5:09 on Friday, August 25th, by the way, only 4 months till Christmas. Get your shopping done now, folks. As we're sitting here right now, Hurricane Harvey is barreling down the Gulf Coast towards Texas, and we wish anyone in the path, or we just wish everyone safety.
Right.
And we'll be able to assess what happens with the hurricane a little later on today. As you've said in the past, hurricanes are great energy. Explain.
Well, once upon a time, there was this enormous disaster. And it was very strange. It sort of lickety-splitted around. You couldn't contain it. And it was called fire. And some brave human, we don't know whether it was a man or a woman, apparently dove into the flames or near the flames and probably picked up a burning stick and carried it back home. And his parents must have been outraged. I mean, how dare he fooled with this stuff from the gods that obviously was wildly out of control and could kill all kinds of creatures. It was fire.
Huh.
And so harnessing hurricanes, harnessing disasters, harnessing catastrophes, becoming doom riders is something that we've done as human beings for at least 1 million years. And the big trick is, I mean, right now we're so primitive that these giant swirls of energy.
It's huge. I'm looking at the map of it right now.
Right,
Hurricane
so,
Harvey,
and we're
yeah.
not regarding them as potential energy that could be tapped. Well, they are potential energy that could be tapped.
I mean, we have wind energy. We have excessive heat.
Right.
We have even waves, and a storm surge could create some sort of energy if we can capture that.
Right, and they're talking about this particular hurricane on the Texas coast lasting 4 to 5 days.
Which is unbelievable.
Yeah, and so that's a real heavy-duty disaster, but like fire, it is an energy source just waiting to be tamed.
Well, tamed and harnessed, if
Right,
you would.
exactly.
What's very interesting about this hurricane, and I've never said this before, I probably have once, this hurricane is really going to test the leadership ability of one Donald Trump if there is a catastrophe. This would be the first major national non-political catastrophe on the United States of America since he's become our president.
Right.
And having said that, it's going to be very interesting to see how him and his administration respond to this, because if you recall, it was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans that pretty much put Bush in, at least with minorities, and the famous thing Kanye West saying George Bush doesn't care about black people,
Right.
really killed and hampered the second George Bush's presidency. It's going to be very interesting to see how Trump responds to this and what he does.
What we've seen so far is that Donald Trump is incapable of any administrative function, that he's not capable of putting together a team of rivals, a team of smart guys and women to work under him. And we just have to hope that with him having removed Kelly, General Kelly, who's now his chief of staff, from the Federal Disaster Management Organization, whatever it's called. FEMA. That whoever slipped into that seat when Kelly left is competent and capable.
How important is it when we have, let's talk about, I mean, you have some perspective, some years on me. How important is it to have a competent leader at the top of the top when we do have these type of disasters?
Well, if we don't have a competent leader, we rely on the institutional momentum of the bureaucracy. And the folks in the bureaucracy have been doing what they're doing for a long, long time. But under George Bush, as you pointed out, because there was an incompetent leader at the top, by the way, who looks like an absolute master of competence.
Genius.
A
Wow.
genius,
I have thought the
compared
same
to
thing.
Donald Trump.
Yes.
But with a moron in charge, we had a moronic response. And we had a response that tried to nickel and dime the people of New Orleans.
New Orleans, the whole of everyone, Mississippi as well.
Yeah,
a lot of people
in the
impacted.
name of private enterprise.
Yes.
So Donald Trump's ideology is as weird to the extent that he has one as George Bush's, if not weirder. Let's hope that he doesn't care about this, he doesn't meddle in this, and that the institutional bureaucracy, the people who've been there for a long time, who know something about what they're doing, take over. We'll have to see. It's all a crapshoot with Donald Trump.
But even with, going back to Bush, and I believe the head of FEMA at the time, I think it was
Brownie.
Mike Brown.
Yes.
It might have been Mike Brown. If I get the first name wrong, I do apologize, but I'm not editing it. I believe Brown was very incompetent. FEMA was incompetent, but because it was under Bush's, administration, he took the heat for it.
Right.
Do you see if somebody in Trump's administration isn't effective, he would take the heat for it, or will they just point?
It's just going to be one more thing in a landslide of 6 catastrophes, 6 embarrassments a day.
Right.
And because there are 6 embarrassments a day, what's news at 2 o'clock ceases to be news by 6 o'clock because there's some new tweet.
That's it's funny. As you know, here, Howard, we're at the studio. We do a lot of different podcasts. One of them is a news podcast. They do a weekly show. The day the show comes out, the numbers are huge. After that, the material is dead.
Right.
And we've experienced that here on our own show. So in the 2 weeks since we've recorded, there have been at least 5 major developments that kind of undermined this president's ability to be a president.
Right.
It all started actually the day after you and I were here in Charlottesville. Or actually,
Right.
it was the night, because it was that Friday night with the tiki torches.
Right.
A bunch of what would you call it?
right-wingers, a bunch
Racist,
of neo-Nazi,
Nazis,
white
KKK.
supremacists, KKK sympathizers through a torchlight parade, which they borrowed straight from the handbook of Adolf Hitler, torchlight parades.
Just that visual alone in
Right.
this day and age of an angry mob with torches marching marching anywhere on U.S. ground, but on the steps of a secondary city in the U.S. That was a scary visual.
And when in Hitler's Germany, if ordinary subjects were allowed to march at all, remember, in Hitler's Germany, the torchlight parades through the streets of Berlin involved tens of thousands of military troops carrying torches. This was a civilian group carried torches, and unlike civilian groups anywhere else in the world, it was armed to the teeth. The one person that Vice News,
Yes.
one of them that they interviewed, took a total of 5 guns off of his body while he was undressing his guns in front of the Vice News cameras. 5 weapons. He had a pistol on his ankle. He had a pistol behind his back. He had a knife hidden on him. He was carrying, and there were several more weapons. God knows where he was hiding them all. So in America, we've got this weird mixture of a gun culture. It's more like a gun cult.
Yes.
It's more like a gun religion. And as Peter Beinart said in The Atlantic, in America, only white people are allowed to openly carry guns.
That's right.
Because black people, when they're even suspected of having guns, are often shot.
Well, there was that man who the gun was in his glove compartment.
Yes.
Said, "I have a gun in here,"
And he was shot.
and did everything exactly the way to the letter of the law
Right.
that you were supposed to behave. Should a police officer ask you if you have a gun, and still
Right.
got shot.
So, and which brings up the subject of Arpaio, the sheriff from
yes.
Arizona.
Arpaio, yeah.
Arpaio. And Donald Trump is openly talking about pardoning him. For what? Arpaio was grabbing people who looked Mexican to him and throwing them in jail for a week because he suspected they might be illegal aliens. It was a total, the Constitution simply didn't apply to these people. And that's how Donald Trump likes things done. He keeps using the word about himself and about other leaders, tough. And he says that with great admiration, that people are tough. Well, for him, being tough means beating innocent people up, which he's encouraged. Probably everybody listening to this has heard him tell his audiences, basically beat him up if you go to court.
Yeah.
I'll pay your legal fees. So he has encouraged this kind of mob violence.
Yeah, it's shocking. So that was Friday night. We had that tiki torch mob, if you would. I can only imagine very similar to what a lynching mob might have looked like 100 years ago here.
Except bigger.
Except bigger and more people. And of national. Like you saw men and women come in from around the country for this event, which was very scary. That was on Friday night. Saturday night, of course, we had the counter protests, which led to one woman being run over by a car. Just horrible videos, and you see the bodies flying, which led to Donald Trump's initial response saying there are people on both sides for this.
Well, there was,
Yeah.
I hate to say this because we're not allowed to say this, so if we lose listeners, we'll lose listeners. Donald Trump was partially right. He was partially right because there are two extremist groups, one from the left and one from the right. The extremist group from the left is Antifa, and they apparently showed up with shields and helmets. Apparently. Why do I say apparently? Only one news outlet seems to have covered this in any depth, and it's Vice News. If you saw the news on CNN or Fox TV or any other outlet, they were just showing you clips from Vice. So, and the clips from Vice covered the white supremacists, but didn't cover the Antifa. And the Antifa are there to fight. The Antifa are there to throw punches. The Antifa are there to throw Molotov cocktails and bricks and bottles. And the problem here is this. America is what it is because of our civic virtues, because we hold back and we don't work out our difficulties violently. We work out our disagreements with words. It is very easy to lose those civic habits. The people of Rwanda discovered that in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s and 1990s, leaders and media started to demonize other people. If you're a Hutu, you should hate the Tutsis. If you're a Tutsi, you should hate the Hutus. And when it wasn't just a matter of civic order breaking down, something had been kindled that replaced civic order, and it was a bonfire of flame, a bonfire of hatred, an absolute conviction that if your next door neighbor were from the opposite tribe, he was out to kill you. And the only way to respond was in self-defense by killing him. And the result was between 750,000 and 1.5 million deaths. It is very easy to send a culture down the slippery slope toward violence. And so the fear is, if you watch the entire Vice piece of coverage, it's about a half an hour long.
It's amazing, and they actually put it on free,
right,
so people could see it.
And the people in it are so monstrous. I mean, for one thing, they are not being anti-black racists. They are being anti-Jewish racists.
Yes.
They are walking down the street shouting, "Jews will not replace us." The media has overlooked that and has pretended that this is all about racism against blacks. And I'm sure that it is.
Because it did start with the whole thing about Robert E. Lee's statue.
Right. But what these people are proclaiming is anti-Semitism and a view of the world in which Jews, who in the United States are about 5 million people, tiny little minuscule...
What percent would that be if there's 3 million?
2%, something like that.
Yeah.
Jews are at most 5% of the population.
Yeah.
So, but they have an ideology and a worldview in which Jews apparently are out to control everything, even though Jews are this pitiful little
population
group.
sect.
Yeah, exactly. The press, the one thing that the militant left and the militant right share is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in the form of pro-Palestinian rights is a big deal on the left.
But can't you be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Semitic?
I doubt it. I think that being pro-Palestinian is as an excuse. It's a cover for being anti-Semitic. But that's something people would have to do a great deal of research on to answer. It's a question. They'd have to, I mean, Bernie Sanders does not, he's Jewish. He does not regard himself as anti-Semitic. And in my eyes, he is, because he's pro-Palestinian and basically anti-Israel. But being anti-Israel is almost compulsory on the intellectual left. And being anti-Semitism is the big deal on the alt-right. So, and it's not really being covered and decried because I think people on both sides want the comfort of holding on to their anti-Semitism. So that's one of the disturbing aspects. I mean, a disturbing aspect of this is that CNN apparently did not have anybody on the ground during the Charlottesville events.
Yes.
Apparently Fox didn't have anybody on the ground during these events in Charlottesville. But Vice did. And as a consequence, everybody had to rely on Vice.
Yes.
We know that we've been starving our news outlets because we've all become accustomed to everything being free.
Yes.
And the news outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN. Well, CNN is apparently doing well with advertising, especially since Trump won
all
the
of them
election.
are. Yeah.
Nonetheless, this means that the number of journalists has been cut dramatically in the course of the last 10 years. And so there weren't enough journalists to give us coverage. So I've had a simple question. In one of the bits of footage of this car slamming into people and then trying to back up, a bunch of people with black helmets and batons in their hands, clubs in their hands, jumped on the back of the car when it was too late, after people had been splattered around the place and killed. No news outlet that I've been able to find tells me who these people with black helmets and clubs were, whether they were on the left, the Antifa, or whether they were on the right, the neo-Nazis. Well, those are details people like you and me need to know. When the president says there were good people on both sides, the Vice coverage gives the impression, no, there were not any good people on the neo-Nazi side. But that's not real coverage. That is not really digging into the situation to see.
But see, here's where I'm going to push back on you a little bit.
Okay.
Because I don't think if you're walking amongst a bunch of neo-Nazis, white fascists, KKK supremacists,
and you don't oppose them, then you're an accomplice in what they're doing.
Yes, because you know what they stand for.
Right.
However, I have marched in rallies on progressive sides where I'm marching for expansion of rights, not the limitation of rights or not the absence of removal of rights.
Right.
Now, could there have been with me at that moment some of these anti-fascist type people hell-bent on violence that co-opted my movement? Perhaps. I still think I'm a good guy on that side of the movement. Right. I don't think you can find one person of good repute who will march with neo-Nazis.
But we don't really know because nobody was covering it in depth except Vice, and this is not a question that they asked. So we have a lot of prejudiced views, both on the left and on the right, whose validity we haven't really been able to check. And that's the news business not doing its job. And it's us. I mean, I use free content all the time. I couldn't afford to pay for everything that I grab material from. So we have a problem. We need a freer press. But meantime, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, remember him?
Of course.
Our AG, our Attorney General, went after the complete list of all of the people who visited an anti-Trump website in order to protest during Trump's inauguration. And guess what? Today, they got it.
Oh, they got
Today,
the
ISP, the internet service provider that had those lists, turned them over or said it would turn them over to Jefferson Beauregard Sessions.
Well, I mean, we have no more privacy online, and to think you ever had it in the first place was naive.
It's not just a matter of privacy. In this case, it's a matter of political suppression. We know that voter suppression has been going on, and now this is the kind of thing that throws a chill into free speech. I have friends on the intellectual left. The intellectual left should share my values, the truth at any price, including the price of your life.
Yes.
No, these people get scared. They're brilliant, and they get scared so easily that it's ridiculous, and then they shut their mouths. And we can't afford shut mouths in the United States. We need to protect our civic virtues that keep us from hammering at each other with clubs and stones and Molotov cocktails, not to mention AR-47s and the weapons that were carried by the neo-Nazis, and that stresses working these things out via vigorous debate.
But, okay, so, and I understand the need for debate, and I understand that, but didn't we already have World War II, and didn't we already end slavery? Like, why the need for people to hold on to lost ideals?
That's a very good question. And we know the answer. Everybody's born with cultural roots.
Mhm.
And when people want to find a way to change their society, they often reach back to the roots of their culture and reinterpret those roots. For example, in Japan, in the 1860s, the United States came in with steamboats and modern artillery, and the Japanese discovered that for all their weaponry and training in the use of the Bushido blade, they were helpless against these things. So a bunch of young samurai took over the government, and they modernized the whole country. They turned it into a Western-style society. They did it by reaching back in time and changing the notion of who the Founding Fathers were. Up until then, the Founding Fathers by whom you measured your actions were the shoguns.
Right.
You know, the prime ministers for all practical purposes. Now, they went back into the distant past and they plucked out the emperor. So in the name of honoring the emperor and repelling the barbarians, which was their slogan, they had legitimacy by reaching back to the emperor himself. People need these deep historical roots. Steve Bannon is a huge fan of returning America to whatever he regards as its cultural roots.
We haven't even talked about him yet. Yeah.
meaning white supremacist. And the people in the neo-Nazi contingent are, I can't tell what roots they're reaching back to, but it's certainly possible that they are trying to legitimize these issues that we thought were settled, like slavery.
Yeah, I mean that's what
and civil rights.
And that's where I think you cannot, and I think it's wrong to try to compare the Antifa and the anti-fascist movement to the KKK, because one is trying to remove civil human rights.
Both are.
I don't think the Antifa is. I don't.
Oh yes, they are. They stopped what's his name, Yiannopoulos, from appearing on a California college campus. I've seen their antecedents when in the 1960s, when we were all roiled about the war in Vietnam. One of the Air Force generals who was running Vietnam was supposed to appear and talk at NYU. And a friend of mine did something I dramatically disagreed with. He and a group of people gathered. They picked up a great big slab of wood, and they had a boar, a pig, on it, and they went charging into this event, and they basically shut down the event. That's not freedom of speech.
No. But yeah, and I think, and I understand. Okay, maybe I'll give you an inch there, but I still think more people are there for the good of the cause, not to suppress others.
Well, when we were marching in Washington, to levitate the Pentagon, that was the phrase used to justify our being there. We were marching. This is against the war in Vietnam. We were marching by the hundreds of thousands. There may have been close to 1 million of us there. And there was this very tiny minority of these wretched, monstrous, horrible people, the anarchists, who are now called the Antifa, and they were running up to store windows and putting bricks through them. That didn't represent the rest of us. That was defacing everything that we were standing for.
So how does that middle ground or that sane and rational protester distance himself from that far left protester?
I'm not sure, because we just kept being peaceful in this 1967 march.
So there really is then a race to arms.
Yeah, there's a race to arms, and that's why I say that the civic fabric could fall apart as easily as as it did in Rwanda.
So this whole thing in Charlottesville happened right around the same exact time that we were getting testy with North Korea, just as we're finding out more about Russia.
Right.
And
as something else was developing.
Yes.
In a tiny country called Bhutan on the border between China and India. China and India every single day have been getting closer and closer to war. These are two nuclear powers. This is the kind of chain reaction we've talked about that set off World War I.
And these are two huge population.
Yeah, 1.2 billion for both of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's half the world is right between those two countries.
Right. It's bigger than all of Europe.
But yes.
It's bigger than all of Europe and the United States combined. Yes. Each one of these countries is bigger than all of that.
Wow.
So, yes, we were distracted, as usual, by local events from seeing what was going on in the bigger picture. And we have to live in that bigger picture, and that bigger picture is where nuclear war may lie.
Well, and it's interesting, I just look at our president, And this comes right back to talking
Our
about
phony president, our
That's
fake
exactly right.
president.
This comes right back to the hurricane that's about to hit the coast of Texas, at Corpus Christi. This goes back to his reaction after Charlottesville, then his red reaction, and then his campaign reaction, and then his other reaction. I mean, I know on this show, if you've listened to any other episode, you know Howard and I are not supportive of President Trump. We question his stability. And I think if we look at just the week alone, and let's not even mention the fact he fired Steve Bannon, which is also kind of, I mean, everyone's gone from his first team that he selected. We have an unstable, unsure, egomaniacal prick for president.
Who trades in hate.
Right.
I mean, at his rallies, he talks about corrupt Hillary, criminal Hillary, for example. And then the audience chants back, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up, and hang her, hang her, hang her. He's appealing to the absolute worst in people. It's very much like the Rwanda situation. Chad, let me throw in one little thing here.
Yeah.
To show you how easily we people of good civic habits can degenerate into violence. In watching the Vice News
Coverage.
whatever it was yesterday, when these people openly said, one person after another talked about getting rid of the Jews, talked about, it was horrible stuff. I felt like putting a bullet into the head of each and every
exactly
one
right.
of them. And that's how civic habits melt down. When you rouse the hate to a certain level, the civic habits aren't able to hold them back, to restrain the hatred anymore.
And it's scary. You know, I did not live through the major civil unrest in the 1960s. I was born in 73. I missed all that. I believe I'm a direct product of that in 1968, or I'm giving away my mom's years here, 66, 67, she moved to Israel for a couple months because the civic unrest here in the U.S. was worse than what she would have found in Israel.
Right.
So she moved to Israel to get away from civic unrest here in the States, where she met my father. So I'm a
Yes.
direct result and product of the civic unrest here. But we don't know what that's like
No.
here in the States. This generation, there's only 2 generations left that know what that's like. I'm putting you in there, Howard, lovingly. What would that look like? Should we have more civic unrest? Because what happened in Charlottesville 2 weeks ago now, that's civic unrest, right?
Right.
Civil unrest. What happens in the state in New York City? Let's say that happens. Will the police turn on us? Will the police join us? And who is the us?
It's a good question. I mean, the question is how efficacious, in part, is protest in the streets.
Well, you said the million people protested to levitate the Pentagon.
It was somewhere between 500,000
Right, but my point,
and a
how
million.
effective is that? It wasn't. We still were in the war into the mid-70s.
Right. Well, until something like 1973.
Yeah.
So, but we certainly made carrying out that war very uncomfortable. Richard Nixon got so upset that one night when there were big protests taking place in Washington, he left the White House and walked into the crowds to try to find out what these people who opposed him were thinking. So we certainly had an impact on the minds of our leaders.
And I'm laughing as you say that because, again, I don't remember Tricky Dick at all. But could you imagine President Trump like, I want to hear you out. Let me go amongst the protesters. Let me talk to the people who don't like me and find out why.
He'd go around the corner from Trump Tower to a steak restaurant.
Yes,
and
or
he'd
the
ask
Trump
the
Hotel.
waitresses, while he was ordering a nice
Whose
steak.
check he's writing out.
Yeah.
What do you think of me? I love you, Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
But that is the world we live in right now, where he does inspire or at least make the concept of violence okay, and it's in his rhetoric. Yet when that violence steps up, he doesn't take any responsibility for that. So what's that about? What is that selective choice? How can one be so naive to selective choice?
Well, Donald Trump is not like any normal human being that you and I have
And he's
ever
our president.
known.
Okay.
Yeah, he is. We've said this often. He's a delusional narcissist, and as a result, everything that happens good is his. He's done it.
Mm-hmm.
He takes credit for it, and everything that's bad that happens is somebody else's fault. Now, we all have this tendency that's been demonstrated by decade after decade after decade of social psychology, that we all have this tendency to take credit for wins and to distance ourselves from losses. But most of us are able to hold these things in balance and realize what our own responsibility is. And when we were not really responsible for something good that happened. Donald Trump lacks those critical capabilities. So Clapper, the former head of the CIA, was on CNN in the last 48 hours, and he looked extremely worried. And he said, basically, this president isn't stable enough to let him near the nuclear buttons. He isn't really fit to be president. And Clapper was right. This guy is... he's marginally insane. He does fit the model of a psychopath.
And as a country, why is that bad? Like, I mean, I know the answer, but like, let's really spell it out. Why is it bad to have a psychopath at the top of the chain?
Well, he claims that he wants to make America great again, right? And America's great in part because it has the respect of the world, especially the respect of our allies. And since Trump was inaugurated, trust in America and Europe has gone down from something like 72%
trust
to 22%.
of America from the Europeans.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Europeans trust in America. So it's plunged dramatically. There is more trust in the Chinese, twice as much trust in the Chinese as there is in Americans. And there's far more trust in Russia than there is in the United States. And it's all because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has basically said, I'm going to take us out of the world, the global game, and where we've been the leaders. Take us out of that global game and we lose our greatness. And
But
we
didn't
have
he make
lost
his
it in the
money
last
on
6
that?
months.
Didn't he make his money on that global game? Who knows?
Yes, he certainly, apparently, I mean, we don't really know, but apparently he got money from Russia. Apparently he got money from a German bank when no American bank would lend him any money anymore because he had a nasty habit of not paying his debts. So, yes, he benefited from that global order. But the fact is, he's a parochially minded person. He's a small town minded person. He's a small minded person. He's a person who's into building walls, not bridges. And because of that, he single-handedly has made America small again.
Well, you brought up the wall, so let's talk about that. On Tuesday night, President Trump had a campaign-style rally. It looked very much like a Nazi movement rally
in Phoenix.
with and I hate using this term, lone African-American behind him.
And have you read the history of that lone
That
African-American?
man, I have, and I highly encourage everyone, go online and find out this man. I hate to say anyone is insane. I'm not a doctor. This man's fucking crazy.
Right.
This man's absolutely crazy and is used by the Trump administration for appearances only.
Right.
And he uses them as well. So it's a very symbiotic relationship they have.
In other words, he's a phony.
He's a complete fraud.
He absolutely does have black skin. That's not the result of putting nail or shoe polish all over himself. But aside from that, his views of the world could get him institutionalized. They're so crazy.
Right. So he has the campaign style rally at which he says, if I don't get money for this wall, I'm going to shut down the government.
Right.
The same wall that was supposed to be bought and paid for by the Mexicans. So can he shut down the government?
No, not single-handedly. But yes, he could. If the Senate and Congress pass a bill raising the debt ceiling, and they send it to the president, he can veto it. And then it takes a 2/3 majority, I believe, to override his veto. So yes, he could stop the government.
This man has too much power, Howard.
He has. He should never have been in politics to begin with.
But he's and so that leads to a conversation I had. As you know, I was on vacation with some people who said, "Why are people still supporting him?" I firmly believe there's 30% of this country who do not feel loved from this country, and as a result, they are just completely defined by that, and they see Donald Trump as that. Can he ever lose that base? I mean, that is a good 33% of this country who just will support him.
Well, so far he hasn't lost that base, and we'll have to see. I mean, we've talked about this before, but Hitler never had more than about 38% of the vote in Germany, which means 62% of Germans voted against him, and yet he took over the country. The Jeff Sessions move to get hands on that list of people who had logged on to a website that was in favor of protesting Trump's inauguration. That's a first step. That's toward the Reichstag fire, the excuse Hitler used to take over the country.
And that's very scary stuff.
Yeah.
Here's my take on this. We don't have a parliamentary government around here.
Right.
But the way Trump's been able to rise to power is very much how you would get a parliamentary style prime minister in place with only 30%, because you have you and I, who I think are mainstream liberals. Is that
Yeah.
mainstream Democrats? We have the far left Democrats, the Bernie, and you and I think would have supported Bernie Sanders should he have gotten the nomination.
Right.
I'm a big fan of his politics, but the non-Trump people. So let's give Trump 35%, right, of the population. I'm doing math here. That
Yeah,
gives us
that's about
65% of the
right.
Americans left, right? Of that 65%, now you still have your traditional conservatives, so that's probably 20%. And you can see how we have all these factions of people who kind of align differently on the spectrum of American politics. But you have that 30%, which is your largest number, that still supports the man at top. And by fractioning, and the term divide and conquer comes in place, but by really fracturing the other 65%, saying, I don't give a shit about the 65% of you, you Republicans, you're blacks, you're Muslims, whoever you are, each one of you is going to be so marginalized that you're not going to want to work with each other, but my 30% is so strong. I'm glad we don't have a parliamentary, because this could have happened earlier.
Right.
We would have been screwed. And so how do you break that 30%, or how do you unite that 65%?
It's very hard to say, because we've talked about this many times, there are two mainstream medias in the United States. There's the mainstream media of the left and the mainstream media of the right. And in the mainstream media of the right, there's an alternative universe. In that universe, the mainstream media of the right, everything that you and I have been saying sounds like it's insane. Yeah. Because there's a whole different world. And the mainstream media of the right is fixated on Bob Menendez in New Jersey,
Yes.
who's in court defending himself against an accusation of bribery, and the hope that Bob Menendez will be convicted and thus have to leave the Congress or the Senate, and that which will give the Republicans an opening to one more vote and make it possible for them to pass things like this wretched anti-medical program that they tried to pass. So there are two different perceptual worlds. But if you look into the world of the Antifa and the world of the white supremacists, there are at least four different perceptual worlds that are so vivid in their outlines that these other worlds, the things that you and I see as genuine disgraces of President Trump, they can see these things as positives, because they say we made this all up about Trump, and that Trump's one of the best leaders that we've ever had. In fact, Trump does that kind of perceptual distortion. He says that, and he said this over the last few days, I have accomplished more in the first 200 days of my presidency than any president in history. Well, any fact-checking PolitiFact-style website
that's not
will show you what other people have accomplished. And by this time in his career, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had passed a huge mess of bills that allowed him to put together the New Deal. And Donald Trump hasn't passed a single bill. However,
not a one.
Yeah. However, our press, the left-wing press, doesn't tell us how many executive orders he's issued. Now, you remember that every time that a Democratic president issues an executive order, the right screams that this is dictatorship. And yet the right is coasting on executive order after executive order, and nobody that I've seen in the press is totaling the number of executive orders or even covering what most of them are.
Well, I think it's just because it's too scary at this point.
Well, there's too much news. I
Well,
mean,
that's
if you
the
have
other
a new tweet every day,
Right.
and you have to analyze it, sometimes 2 or 3 tweets a day, you've got no time left to investigate.
But is he smart enough to release those tweets as a chance to divide, conquer, distract?
He's not smart.
Or is it lucky? Or is it just, because if he's
It's
not
impulse.
smart, it's impulse. But isn't impulse smart? Aren't you born
Yes,
with
impulse
impulse?
can be smart, but he's not laying out, in my belief, because none of us have spent time in Donald Trump's head, thank God.
Baruch
Yeah.
Hashem.
But he does these things on impulse. And if you look at his tweet site, which I've taken to doing every day or two now, he has a vast number of seemingly sane tweets. And then there are these wild ones against Mitch McConnell
Yes.
and fellow Republicans, and in which in which he lies after. But we all know that just about everything that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth is a lie. It's a self-delusion. So he works on impulse. His impulse is not organized to achieve a long-range strategic goal. It's simply there if he feels that he's been hit and victimized. It's there to hit back at the person he feels has bullied him. Now, in fact, all those people who he feels have bullied him are far smaller than he is.
Financially, perhaps.
Yeah, so it's, we go back to the studies of bullies that demonstrate that bullies feel they're being victimized and are only lashing out in response to the attacks on them. Well, that's how Donald Trump sees the world, nonstop series of attacks on him. And look, we Democrats are obliging enough to attack him every day because we hate him, loathe him, despise him. And we know that he's not competent to be president of the United States. And we know that Clapper was right and that putting a man this unstable near the nuclear button is threatening species suicide.
Yeah, and that's what so amazes me is that 35%, again, if we're going to say 35 for this show, they want this. I firmly believe they want this instability in our, and I don't understand the desire to chop off one's leg.
It goes back to something we talked about when we started these dialogues about Trump. And, we wondered what was his appeal. Well, people live on a status hierarchy. They live in a pecking order. And the more progress that blacks have made, that Asians have made, that Jews have made in this country, the lower these people with only a high school education have slipped on the status hierarchy. Now, there's something that Tversky and Kahneman call risk aversion. We humans really, and it's not just us, it's chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys, we hate to lose something that we have taken for granted as not just ours, but a part of our very identity. And so the undereducated white workers have been taking it on the chin with one identity loss after another as blacks have gotten preferential treatment.
But why? And I understand some view it as their right to get and have. But don't you have to work to get?
No, we're not talking about getting money.
No,
we're
I knew.
talking about getting stature. And the stature that these people used to have in the 50s and the 60s, they knew that they would forever stand on the heads and shoulders of black people, that black people would be below them on the totem pole. And now that's changed. And they are on the bottom of the totem pole. So they are seething with hate and anger. And the one guy who gives them an excuse to vent their hate and anger and a promise of turning the world upside down so that they are once again above everybody else, even though they didn't finish high school or they barely finished high school, that one man is Donald Trump.
So, I've asked on this show, what do we do? And Brian Avers, who we've had on the show in the past, offered up some...
And who's back.
Is he back in New York?
Yes, he's back
in
New York.
Oh, Brian, if you're listening, can we have him back on?
Yeah, we can have him
All right,
back
I'm inviting you back on, Brian, on the show. So we have to come back. He offered up some advice, and there's a lot of places online now who kind of say, get involved, get involved, get involved. Are we doing enough?
No, because right now we're still struggling to determine who our leader is on the Democratic left.
Does it have to be the Democratic left, or can't it just be an opposition?
The two-party system in the United States has continuously trounced any sort of third-party efforts whatsoever.
Right.
So if we're going to accomplish anything in 2018 when the next elections take place, we're going to have to be united. And to be united, we have to be united against a leader who we regard as charismatic and who can get as much coverage as Donald Trump gets. Because Trump's genius, and he does have a genius, is for self-publicity.
And we spent show after show after show talking about the madness. So right there, you can see. But do we need a two-party political system, or can't we have a two-party social system? Why is our politics so tied into our social construct?
Well, that's a good question. When parties emerged, there were parties in Byzantium, which was, once upon a time, Rome ruled the Western world. And Constantine, an emperor, decided to move Rome from Rome to a destination further east, and that was Byzantium. So he made that the new Rome. It was the new head of the Roman Empire, the whole Roman Empire. Well, there were these sports teams that played each other, and their fans were called either the Blues or the Greens. And the Blues and the Greens started with wars of words,
Mhm.
and that escalated into words of actual violence. And then one day, the members of one of these groups, in their picnic baskets, went to the stadium with weapons under the fruits. And they started killing the people on the other side. Well, guess what? They were ignoring the outside world at the time. And they so weakened Byzantine society with this internecine battle that a group of desert nomads was able to strip them of most of their empire in a very short amount of time. The desert nomads were the Mohammedans, the Muslims.
And right now we have a bunch of desert nomads our own trying to strip us from the outside in Russia and North Korea, trying to continually knock us down a peg.
In Russia, North Korea,
China.
Iran, and most important, China.
Financially.
And all of these people would like to knock us down a peg because if we go down a peg, China goes to number one. And the biggest payoff that humans strive for isn't money, it's status. And getting to number one, that's a big status move. And that's what China's out for, and that's what China's making progress on day by day.
So we started this with the hurricane warning and the president's effectiveness. Should something, again, we don't want horrible things to happen over the next couple of days in Texas, but should something happen over there, would that be the next and last shoe, his response, or are we out of shoes and do shoes not count anymore?
One of the things that we all hopefully learned during the election, when every sane and rational person predicted that Trump was about to totally implode, is that Trump doesn't follow the rules of normal politics.
Mhm.
And we pundits are incapable of making accurate predictions about Donald Trump. So I have the suspicion that you are right when you say that he has this core 30%. And that core 30% is the group of people who, as he said, I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and they'd forgive me. Whether that core, is that core ever going to give up Donald Trump? Well, is it ever going to give up what it sees as its right to climb back above blacks and other minorities and stand on their shoulders and spit down at their heads? Is it going to ever give up its right to a higher stature in society? That's something no human readily gives up. And Donald Trump is their only hope.
You don't find a lot of middle-class people willingly go down.
Right. No, us middle-class people do not willingly go down either.
Yeah,
Just think of your bank account. If suddenly everything in your bank account disappeared and your credit card debt went up to $60,000, how would that affect your sense of identity?
Oh, I'd be devastated.
Right. So none of us readily give up our position on the totem pole, and what's in our bank account is a big part of where we feel we stand on the totem pole, but it's not the biggest part. The biggest part is this business of who can you hate, who can you look down on, who can you blame for everything, who can you kick around.
And and on that totem pole, who can you stand on?
Yeah.
We have to cut our show short. Are you back up with me on Monday?
Yes, I'm
okay, good.
Absolutely here on Monday.
So we're going to get this show out as fast as can be. So hopefully, well, if you're listening to it, you know we got it out.
Right.
And then you're back with me on Monday. Howard, your website.
HowardBloom.net.
You can find me at thehangarstudios.com. Howard is on Twitter. You've been tweeting a lot. You're on Facebook. Follow Howard's Facebook. You're maxed out at 5,000 friends.
Yeah, but I have an overflow page, a fan page.
Yes.
And I post everything that I post on both of those pages.
So you definitely want to check it out. Again, our thoughts are with people in Texas and the Gulf states. Hopefully the storm isn't as bad as they say, or if it is,
may everybody come out healthy.
Exactly, and if it is as bad, heed the warnings, and obviously we want first responders to do a great job. Howard, I missed you. So here's what's going to happen. We have to cut our show short today because Howard, I have somebody else coming into the studio, and Howard and I are going to get caught up. So we're going to turn off the microphones. Let's get caught up, all right?
Okay, terrific.
All right, have a great week, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, Chad.
You've been listening to Howard Bloom Saves the Universe with Howard Bloom and Chad Dugatz. To learn more about Howard, visit howardbloom.net. Howard Bloom Saves the Universe is a production of Pro Media and Howard Bloom. Copyright 2015 by Howard Bloom. I'm Matt Tombs.